welcome all to this really quite special counterfire interview with Granville Williams, author and journalist of Media North quarterly publication. Granville is, of course, also an NUJ member. I'm Unjum Mirza, a member of Counterfire and ASLEF, the Train Drivers Union. Today we're going to discuss an incredible moment in British working class history, the great miners' victory in 1972, with a particular focus on the Battle of Saltley Gate. So welcome, Granville, first.
Thank you.
Okay. What I'd like to start with is not just the Battle of Saltley Gate, but the miners' strike itself, its importance in British history. The first miners' strike, of course, national miners' strike since the general strike in 1926.
Well, yes, the importance of the strike, of course, historically, I mean, it's 50 years on that we remember a significant event. The two things about it are important. Firstly, that the union, it wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been a change in the union rule, because the vote for strike was just over the 55% that was required. But once the vote was taken, everybody came out, and that's significant because you've got to think forward to 1984-85, the miners' strike then, when key sections did not come out. Nottingham and sections in the Midlands, pits in the Midlands, didn't come out. It was a solid, unanimous strike, fully supported by all the early NUM members. And the reason is very simple. For years, coal mining was seen as marginal. You'd already got the growth of North Sea gas, so that the heating, I remember this very well when I was taken in the early 50s around a gasworks. Everybody's heating was by coal gas, and coal was what kept the economy going, the fuel drive. Of course, when you got to 72, we had North Sea oil, and so everybody thought, and I was in the International Socialists at the time, and the National Council, I remember the meeting. A lot of people said they're not going to win. This is in the early days. How can they win? And what we saw was a quite amazing spectacle of solidarity. So that, first of all, the first key factor, a united union involving all of the NUM members, able then, and this is the key point about Arthur Scargill. When I lived in Yorkshire up until 1969, when I went down to the southwest, I came across a very significant group of militant miners who felt they were just their pits were closing, their pay was terrible. What we're going to do about it? And Arthur Scargill then was not known. But he was a very significant figure within a very militant group of Yorkshire miners who began to using the tactic of the flying picket, to go on unofficial strike in 1969 and a bit before. And I think that's where we saw part of what the tactic was that was then used during the 71 strike, which was the flying picket, so that the miners weren't just passive, standing by their pits. They went out to power stations, they fanned out across the country, and that was a key point. And the other significant factor was everybody, to my knowledge, there was very little hostility towards the miners' action within the trade union movement. You go forward to 1984-85, some sections in the trade union movement did not give active support to the miners. That wasn't the case in 71-72. So in 71-72, as you moved towards the strike, people weren't certain about what might happen, but they supported it. They thought they were right because the miners really had sunk down the league a table of high pay. They were poorly paid, and that was the significance of it. So the solidarity on three levels, I think, within the union, united, and by the way, it was led by a right winger, Joe Gormley, but Gormley was pushed along with what was going on. He had to, and as well as that, you had, of course, the fact that as you moved around the country, there weren't, as we've now got, anti-trade union laws that limited picketing. So you could picket and you could ask for solidarity action from the power workers, from the dock workers, and you got it. So that the idea that the government had, and by the way, it wasn't when I said the international socialists were uncertain about what might happen when the early days of the strike were on. Most of the newspapers were predicting they'd be defeated. The government thought they'd be defeated. And it didn't happen because they were able to constrict the flow of coal. And so you began to gradually get the power stations cutting down, even closing down. Some closed down because they couldn't get coal to generate electricity. So I think those are the key features: solidarity, and a sense the miners had been just treated abysmally in terms of the Heath government had a pay freeze. Oh, there were limits on pay, and of course this was the thing that they broke. This is the thing that the miners were if you want, the spearhead that led to the breaking of any kind of incomes policy, if you want, by the Heath government.
And that's fascinating. So you've got, on the one hand, I think as Woodrow Wyatt actually said, really to capture, everybody thought the miners would be defeated. In fact, he wrote in the Daily Mirror, did he not, that, you know, they had everything stacked against them, as futile as the, you know, his words were, you know, the Light Brigade's famous charge as you know, futile as that, and of course on the other side you're mentioning the level developments of amongst the rank and file in terms of solidarity within the union with the right wing leadership. Very early on, of course, Joe Gormley does say, to quote again, you know, these workers are damn sight more militant than we'd want them to be. So that kind of tension is there already at the beginning of the miners' strike. But could you maybe elaborate a bit on the sheer level of engagement of miners themselves in picketing duty? You know, the inventiveness and creative and imaginative you know, methods they used in picketing and flying, you know, as flying squads and flying pickets.
Well, the flying picket tactic was, of course, the key thing about it, that you'd begin to get, you built up a network of information of where there'd be coal stocks, where there were issues you need to deal with. And I think one of the key things as well is that as miners spread out across the country to the ports and to power stations, I mean, sometimes, of course, it was quite easy. I remember going to Rugeley, the Lee Hall Colliery, which is up in Staffordshire, and there were two power stations, Rugeley A and B, just by the side of it. So it's dead easy to picket them. But sometimes you had to go out into the wilds, and there you'd get this support often of students and other workers. I mean, one of the things that it's very interesting to read about the recollections of students at that time. Instinctively, a lot of students in the universities, because you've got to remember after 68, that wave of radicalization, a lot of students in universities were very open to support. They didn't see a problem of going out on the picket line. And indeed, I remember reading one NUM instruction that said, we're happy about this, but just make sure it's an NUM official picket line. We've got to have at least one miner there. So this idea that you could actually draw on support from a broad range of other unions, but also students and individuals who felt that they should support the miners. So I think it's quite significant that scale of support. It was something that was remarkable in one sense, because even in those days, that idea that trade unions, that the hostility to trade unions was there, but it wasn't as savage as was built up under Thatcherism. But so I think was remarkable was that wherever you looked, there was a unity amongst trade unionists, so that the unions like the engineering union, which in its later days was dominated by the right wing, at that time, also the T&G, unions that were on the left. They were important, significant, big unions, and they were actually actively supporting the dispute. So I think that was a significant factor. I'd also add one other thing, and that was that the newspapers, whilst you've described Woodrow Wyatt attacking them, there were still, in those days, you still had a key group of industrial correspondents on newspapers. And industrial correspondents would get out there and be reporting. So they would be reporting both on their local regional newspapers and on the national papers. And of course, there was hostility towards the NUM, but it wasn't on that level of hostility that you had amongst the national newspapers during the 1984-85 strike, where incessantly the theme of violence was used, violence by pickets. During the 72 strike, essentially, it was very difficult to wind up that theme of the militant, nasty, violent miners, because it wasn't there in the main. And even the police were not, at that stage, it came later, were not trained in those violent, intrusive, paramilitary forms of action. You look at pictures from that time, there's no riot shields. The police were, in the main, I'm not romanticizing them, but in the main, the issue of violence couldn't be used against the miners because it wasn't there. There was a kind of acceptance that this was going to happen because you were allowed to picket. You were allowed to picket a colliery. You were allowed to picket a power station. You were allowed to picket somewhere that you thought was undermining the effectiveness of your industrial action. So it's very important.
I totally agree. I mean, we'll come back to the police, maybe, I can't remember his name, the chief constable at Saltley Gate, and Capper. The Reginald Mauldin, the Home Secretary, recalling him being informed by the chief constable Capper that over my dead body, these gates will close. And of course, does note in his memoirs that, you know, I did constrain myself to call him to inquire about his health. So but we'll come to that. We're jumping ahead. Maybe a bit on. So you focused on solidarity there. The tactics used and the sheer creative, imaginative tactics used by the miners themselves. I myself always loved the idea of the miners' navy going along the Thames, picketing out supplies to the power stations along the Thames. I mean, it's just an amazing moment. But also the solidarity amongst other groups of workers. Of course, you've got the power workers, the engineers, the docks, and the T&G, the rail unions, the NUR as it was then, the RMT today, and ASLEF, the train drivers union. I mean, as an ASLEF member myself, I've always loved the story that was counted in the Times afterwards, where the ASLEF driver and the NUR guard refused to take the train out of the yard because there was a picket, but management said there's no picket. So there's a rushed call to ASLEF head office. From there over to the NUM. Of course, they do send over two pickets who unfurled the banner, official picket line over the rail bridge, and of course that train does not leave that yard. Is that sense of solidarity across the trade union movement? If it gives a sense of that.
Yeah, and to pay tribute as well. I mean, ASLEV and the NUR, that solidarity was there, and I remember too during the 84-85 strike in the area I live in, that the ASLEV Nottingley branch, which was a pit, which was just, I can still see some of the evidence of what was around in that area, about 3 or 4 miles away, where they wouldn't move coal. They wouldn't move coal. I mean, that solidarity is so important within the trade union movement. Secondary support, and of course they could do that. And I come back to the point. The laws that affecting trade unions at that time meant there was that ability to have that solidarity, secondary action, without the kind of appalling sanctions that would be later used. So yeah, I think that what you're describing in terms of the NUR as ASLEV, I think you can replicate that up and down the country at that time. But and similarly in other disputes later on. I mean, not just, by the way, in Yorkshire and in Midlands as elsewhere, very, very heroic solidarity action by ASLEV NUR people to try to stop the movement of coal in the 72 dispute and in 84-85 too.
Okay, well, on that note, let's move towards a key moment in British working class history, the Battle of Saltley Gate, the lead up to and the famous meeting, Scargill addressing the East Birmingham District Committee, and addresses them, says, are you going to stand by and watch the miners get battered, or will you become immortal? And of course, this isn't. Rather than me go on, do you want to describe?
Okay, well, I mean, I think it's important to put it in the context of what happened. So Saltley Gate was a huge coking plant, and there's huge stores over, I think, over 100,000 tons of coke piled up there. And the week before, so if you take it back, the week Saltley Gate happened on the closure of the gate happened on the 10th of February. But if you go back through that week, that's Thursday. From the Monday, you began to get more pickets. There had been a few pickets there the week before, ineffective, because they couldn't stop the lorries going in to fill up and move out with the coal. And Arthur Scargill came down from Yorkshire on the weekend and met Waters. Frank Waters, by the way, was a key figure. He was the Communist Party organizer for the Midlands, but he ran the Star Club in Birmingham, which is most of the left used to go there, have a pint, whatever. It was a quite open place. You could easily go in. It had a bookshop as well, which was a good source for left-wing material. So Arthur Scargill came down to see Waters. Waters knew the dynamics of the trade union movement in Birmingham, because I need just to point out to you, this is the industrial world of Birmingham in the 70s was quite amazing. I mean, it was a huge concentration of just car engineering and lots of other industries scattered around, big factories. And these factories were well organized, but they had a reputation for what we call money militancy. You weren't bothered about big issues. You wanted to get the rate for the job. And so you'd always be getting strikes. And the reputation that the Birmingham trade unionists had was, they're in it for themselves. The trade unionists were in it for themselves. And that was something that you heard a lot of. But the importance about it, let me give you two examples. The transport union, there was an official called Alan Law, And the T&G, his branch, when it met, it didn't meet in a pub room or something. It met in a cinema. Hundreds of lorry drivers would come along to the meetings. It was a very activist branch because Alan Law was always able to use his industrial power. So if there was going to be a strike, it reminded me of Alan Hoffa, Jimmy Hoffa, the American guy. He always used to say, "Oh, he's going to disrupt the country." Well, if the T&G drivers went on strike, car delivery drivers, it did have an impact. So, but Alan Law really was a key figure when it came to supporting the miners at Saltley. He supplied both pickets, but also food. His members supplied accommodation for the miners coming to the Birmingham. I just mentioned one other thing. The Birmingham Trades Council, again, I don't know what your experience is of a Trades Council, but the Birmingham Trades Council, when it met in that period, 72, it had to have a hall. It had to have, because the delegates would always be more than 150, 200, and they came from factories. They didn't just come from trade union branches. They represented factories where they worked. So it was very important. And then add to that, and this is the significance of the meeting you're talking about, which Arthur Scargill went to speak at. Birmingham had two engineering union districts, an East and a West district. The West district was dominated by the right wing. And actually, Scargill had already been to talk to them, and they dissuaded us, "Oh, they can't do out. There's nothing we can do." He'd already spoken to some right-wing engineering officials. And then he met Arthur Harper. And Arthur Harper was in the East District, and the East District had got a very strong, broad left movement. Most of the big factories, their conveners used to meet regularly, talk about what was going on. And so Arthur, and by the way, as the president of the East District, I knew Arthur very well. He was a very impressive man. He was a former paratrooper, spoke with a deep black country accent, which he deliberately used when he was negotiating with management to confuse them. He was a very powerful man, both in the sense that when he walked along, he oozed energy, but he was the one, as you say, got Arthur Scargill to go and speak at an East District committee. And at that, they then called an emergency shop stewards meeting, and that was the key. The figure, I think it was more than, normally several hundred shop stewards would attend these meetings. These were the shop stewards from the tractors and transmissions, SU carburettors, plants that had had a rich history of industrial struggle. SU carburettors, by the way, was the first where the women there said, Fords had done it elsewhere, but in Birmingham, it was the women SU carburettors that took the stand on it. So when that shop stewards meeting took place, and they said, go back to your factories and call the men out, it wasn't to go on strike, it was just in solidarity action, get your banners. And so tractors and transmissions, where about, I think, 4,500, 5,000 people worked, probably about 1,500, 2,000 came on the march. Not everybody, but significant numbers. And that all of the other engineering factories around Saltley came on that march on the 10th of February. But the other significant point was that other unions like the T&G, the vehicle builders unions, all of these also had informal meetings to say, we support it, we support it. So that's why I think what you had in Birmingham at that time, which was made it possible for that amazing act of solidarity between the miners and the engineers and workers and the car workers and so on, was that there was a network. And I wouldn't stress, though, that Harper was a very powerful orator. I mean, it was his weight that I think swung people. People listened to him. And I've mentioned his factory, highly organised. Well, they're one of the highest paid in the British Leyland Group, and that sort of power. He understood politics. Arthur later joined the International Socialists and became very active with it. But he understood politics, but he saw himself as able to harness that militancy, in this case, in support of the miners. And it was a brilliant move. It was a brilliant move to get those shop stewards to go back to all of their plants in the East District, East Birmingham area of Birmingham, and get them to move out. And so on that day, the 10th of February, Tractors and Transmissions, their banner leads, and as they walk along, workers from other plants like Morris Commercial, they turn out. And in the end, around between 8,000 to 10,000 engineering workers moved over and came over towards Saltley Gate. And that's where the chant, "Close the gates," started to be heard. Close the gates, close the gates. Now, you've got to remember that each day up until the 10th of February, there had been pickets, police, so that on the 10th of February, there were about 600 to 800, I think probably 800 police outside Saltley Gates. There'd already lots and lots of people who'd come from other factories to support the miners anyway, before the engineering workers came over. So by the time you got, I think it was around, I forget the timing actually, I think it was either 10:30 or 11:30. By the time Arthur was leading the engineering workers over the hill down to Saltley, you'd already got such a massive concentration of workers. And the tactic was very simple. It wasn't to go in for a confrontation with the police, it was just saying, "You've lost." Mm-hmm. And so, and the chief constable, a man called Derek Capper, he closed the gates. But I'd stress two things about what happened over those 4 days leading up to the closure of the gate. One was that there was there was battling and scuffling going on all the time. There were arrests made, but the level of violence, I'm not going to say there wasn't violence by the police, there was violence. But I mean, I had a combi coat, which my mum got me for my 18th birthday. And I was there, and the next minute I'm on the floor, and the copper had literally got hold of me by my coat. And as I fell, he ripped the whole of the seams down. But when I was on the ground, nobody started kicking me or anything like that. That was it. He was away doing something else. There was violence of a sort, but I looked at and seen the newsreel of Orgreave, and what happened at Saltley was that the police was literally overwhelmed by the sheer level of numbers on the 10th of February. But on the days before, I'm told they did have special patrol group police at Saltley, but none of them ever had truncheons, never used truncheons or anything, the sorts of things that happened at Orgreave. None of those happened at Saltley. So again, what you had, and I think this is something that we have to learn from, I'm arguing there was very little violence, but the narrative which Maudling and the Tories used was that there was violence by the engineers and the pickets. It's nonsense. There wasn't violence there, but that was the narrative that was used post-Saltley to begin. What we saw was the paramilitary movement to organise the police to deal with civil disorder, i.e. with strikes. But it wasn't something you could see there. I didn't see, and other people differ on this, but I was at Saltley on all of the days of that industrial action. I was there every day. I saw it all. Lots of other people were there as well. And I think that's what was significant of it, the way in which very quickly it was seized on as being an example of, God, they're violent, this is violent. It wasn't, it was a sheer massive solidarity of the engineering workers that closed the gates, not bloody confrontations with the police. They recognised they'd lost. That's why they hated it. By the way, Derek Capper, the chief constable, said it was the worst day of his life. Arthur Harper said it was the best day of my life since I've been demobbed from the army. So it's a different thing.
Well, that kind of says it all, really. That was an absolutely fascinating, quite an inspiring account of the Battle of Saltley, and of course they marched, as he said, chanting, "Close the gate, close the gate." But of course, the politically demanding down with Heath, down with the Tories, or Tories out, and etc. It was always understood the political context, and you're absolutely right about the violence. Of course, later on, the government and the establishment never forgave the miners for that, and we saw the development of how the state developed and the police developed, and certainly with the Battle of Orgreave and the miners' strike and subsequent since, of course, as well. Of course, at the time, the British state was right at the heart of violent events, not just here, but of course abroad as well.
Absolutely.
We had the Bloody Sunday event.
You're talking about just the anniversary of Bloody Sunday. I mean, my focus is on what happened at Saltley. I'm talking about the things I saw there.
No, absolutely.
I don't romanticize what the state will do.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, thank you for that, Granville. But two kind of things to try and wrap this up is, firstly, a kind of a remembrance for Fred Matthews, who died when struck by impact under the wheels of a lorry at a power station just outside Dunthorpe. From Hatfield, if I remember correctly, originally. And the funeral, thousands came to the funeral.
It's really amazing, 10,000 people. Yeah,
it's astonishing. So just a kind of a remembrance for Fred Matthews, really. I mean, is there anything particular you would like to add to?
Yeah, well, there were two miners killed during the strike, and I think with the NUM in Barnsley, where the office still is, they hold an annual remembrance for that. So these issues, I think, remind us that what happened at Saltley. So the drivers at Saltley, many of them were union members. And one of the lessons, I think, that was learned is you've got to de-unionize the trucking industry. And a lot of that began to happen, the kind of quite deliberate policy. And I do think that the success of some of the miners at Saltley in turning away lorries, others and non-union drivers are actually getting huge amounts of money to go in there and get loads out. And I think, again, looking backwards and forwards, that was one of the things about the 84-85 strike, the way that you'd got this huge growth of a non-unionized haulage industry that could be used to move into places like Orgreave and take out coke from there. So that's one of the lessons. But I think, yes, that we should remember the death of Fred Matthews and the way in which the event happened. It was a lorry that drove at him, as I recollect it, unless you've got some other information from that time.
No, that's absolutely spot on. And finally, given we've recently noticed an uptick in strike activity over the period of COVID, particularly over attacks on what the employers call fire and rehire, the attacks on jobs, terms, conditions, safety, and the general cost of living crisis that we have at the moment. We've seen quite a significant and sustained kind of uptick in strike activity. I mean, what lessons would to end? What lessons do you believe 72 holds for us today?
Well, first of all, nothing is transferable in a simple way. I mean, the factories have gone that sustained that solidarity action. The car plants and the engineering plants, some of them are still there in Birmingham, but many of them face the consequence of the deindustrialization that was hitting other parts of the country. Now, so that when I went to speak to Birmingham Trades Council about 8 or 9 years ago now, and it's not the same Trades Council because the delegates that were there in the 70s have gone. However, what you do see, and I find interesting, is the way in which we are seeing, if I refer, for example, to Sheffield at the moment, where we find a quite imaginative movement by fast food delivery workers who are taking strike action. You're seeing lots of actions taken to try and either get unions, to try and organize unions, get a voice. And all I think is that we're in a very different world. The notion that you could have, and I think the unions recognize this, unions like Unite recognize it, that you've got to get in there and organize often small groups of workers and try and build for success on that. I mean, I've written quite a lot about Amazon recently, and it is striking. You see, in America, we've seen the lengths to which Amazon would go in Bessemer, Alabama, to block a union. And incredibly, the National Labor Board in America said Amazon's going to have a recount on that. Now, here in this country, we're still struggling to get a toehold in what's becoming a very powerful organization. And they're absolutely determined to try and block unions in there. So we're going to see some big battles coming up, I think, around the need to organize unions to give people a voice, because the amazing thing about Amazon is the way in which it projects itself as this, worker-friendly organization, when the reality is that when you speak to workers who've been in Amazon, it's the opposite of that. So I think there are a number of issues there are lots of issues around which we'll struggle. We'd never ever, I'm not being pessimistic here, we'll never ever reproduce the kind of amazing solidarity that happened at Saltley, because the economic and physical and the industrial conditions don't exist anymore. The members that exist, Austin Longbridge had 30,000 workers, for goodness sake. These conditions have gone. And so we have to learn about the reality of a different world in which we have to organize a union. That's true of my union, the NUJ. We won't end up organizing in big newspaper offices anymore. They've gone. We've got to be more flexible, imaginative in the way in which we try and build our unions. We need unions, let's be clear about it. We need unions to defend not just wages and conditions, but also to be part of a broader social and political movement. And I think that one of the key things that I certainly have learned over the years is that unless you are active in a union, unless you're active in trying to keep a voice there or an organized presence of workers, you're in a much weaker position. So that would be one of the things I'd learned. I just mentioned one other thing. This is controversial, but I think I would want to do it. I think that Arthur Scargill, Saltley was an amazing moment, an incredible moment. But there was a debate about what happened at Orgreave, because in a sense, I do think that there was a sense you could reproduce Saltley at Orgreave, and it wasn't there because you'd already got the the steel industry had already been savaged by Thatcher. So there was a key industry in Sheffield, close to Orgreave, but that had already been savaged. And so what you had, I think, was at Orgreave was that the state, and in particular Thatcher, had learnt a really hard lesson. And that was, if you're going to take on workers, groups of workers who were determined, and the miners were, for goodness sake, a year-long strike in 84-85. Who else, what other group of workers would do that? She organised the power of the state, and that meant the police, the security services, and everything else. And that's the lesson I draw, is that yes, we were victorious in 72, but Thatcher learnt in terms of the change of the trade union laws, in the way in which the whole development of a paramilitary police force, all of that, we've read the consequence. That doesn't mean to say we can't win. I live near to a plant here called Superdrug in West Yorkshire. The Superdrug, in the height of the Depression, the management tore up all the agreements, and all of the people in that Superdrug plant went on strike, 24 hours, 7-day-a-week picket. The key figures who led that strike were miners who had been made redundant from Frickley Colliery after the round of pit closures of 93. Amazing to see the solidarity. It can be done. We could win with different conditions for us to do it under, but we can do it. And Superdrug for me highlighted that. You had the Unite Union, absolutely solid, supporting the workers. United Workers, a group, Polish workers in that plant, all of them came out. Everybody came out on strike, and they won it. They won the conditions. They got them to the company, which was a Hong Kong, global company, to back off. And they did it because they were organised, and they've got people, really experienced trade unionists who had cut their teeth in the NUM. So that would be my message: is that we can win. We need to build a solid, confident trade union movement to do it.
Thank you, Granville. I mean, that's a wonderful way to end. Indeed, I mean, Scargill did say at the events of Saltley that it wasn't a picket line that won Saltley, that closed the gates. It was the working class that closed Saltley. And in that sense, the history, the memory of that period translated immediately to kind of struggles today, and organising, agitating, and striking today are so important, and solidarity being the bedrock of that. Once again, thank you so much, Granville, for joining us.
Okay, thanks. Bye.